So, what kinds of things can we have our classes do, our student and teacher class? Well, the answer is almost limitless. You can have them do a lot of things. Anything that you can write a function for, you can have it do. But let me show you a very, very common, almost every class will have this function built into it. Besides a constructor, which is necessary, which is you need to have it. The other function, and not absolutely necessary, but that most classes include, is what's called a toString function. So that's a function that will create a string containing all the information about that object that you would want a user to know. So it's a function that you can call whenever you want to print out just a summary of what that object contains or what that instance of the class contains. Okay, so let's make a toString function. Let's add a toString function for our student class. Okay, so let me show you how to write a function. Now, it's going to look a little different from the constructor function. The constructor function was special. It's a special function that has kind of its own, it's called this a signature, the template that you use to create the function. That's called the function signature or method signature. I'm going to start to use that word method because that's kind of the way that Java programmers talk. Instead of saying function, they'll say method. So the method signature for the constructor is a little bit special, different from kind of your typical method signature for just a random function method that you want to write. So let's write a toString method for this student class. So I'm going to start by putting a few keywords in. Okay, public. Now we've seen that word before. We use that word in the constructor signature. Public means anybody can access it, so you don't have to have any special privileges to access this function. So it's publicly available. Now next, you didn't have to do this in the constructor function, but I'm going to put, as if I were declaring a variable, I'm going to put the variable type. This is called the return type. This is the type of answer or result that's going to kick back to the calling function. So it's going to kick back, what I'm saying is it's going to kick back an answer or a value that's a string that the calling function can then use in its processing. Okay, so I'm going to put what's this called the return type. So it's going to return, it's going to kick back a string to the calling program. So public string, and then I'm going to put the name of the function, toString. Okay, now notice the camel case, small t o capital S-T-R-A-N-G. It's called camel case, and that's customary to use in Java when you're naming functions and variables and so forth. So toString. And then every function has a parameter list. Even though you may not include parameters there, you still need the parentheses to indicate that it's a function and it may have a parameter list. Okay, now in this case, and then we have our open and close curly braces to put our code in. Okay, now in this case, you think about, okay, do I need to give it any information? If I'm going to call the toString method, what I'm asking it to do is put together a string that can be printed that contains all the vital information about this student. Think about, do I need to give it any information from the outside in order for it to be able to do its job? Well, not really, because all the information it needs is within the class itself. It is within the object itself. It's already holding the last name, first name, grade level, and student ID there. So I don't need to give it any external information in order for it to do its job. So therefore, I'm not going to put any parameters there. I don't need to set up a parameter list. But I still need the parentheses there just as standard function notation, method notation for Java. Okay, so what I do next inside the function is I put the code to create a string that's going to have all the relevant information about the student that you think a user might need to know. And then I'm going to return it, kick it back to the calling program so that the calling program can then use that string however it wants. It might print it out, might combine it with other strings, who knows. Okay, but I want to create a string that's going to contain all the relevant information about this student. Okay, so let's make a variable to hold that string. Okay, so I'll call it return string. Okay, that'll be the string that I'm going to return, kick back to the main calling program. And I'll start it off just as an empty string, just to give it an initial value. Okay, now the toString method, this is up to you. You can format this however you want. You can put whatever information that you think that the user might want to know about a generic student. Okay, so I'm just going to list out all the information in a string so that, if I need to have a kind of a quick snapshot of who this student is, I can see that. Okay, so let me just start constructing this return string. Okay, so I'll put maybe a label for the last name, and then I'll actually put the last name. Okay, so it has that. Okay, then I'll put maybe a new line character. So it starts a new line. And then I'll put maybe a label for the first name. And I'll actually put first name. Oops. Okay, and so on. So you can see I can start constructing a string that has all the relevant information about the object I've created, and you can put as much information or as little as you think is appropriate. Okay, for now I'm just going to stop there. You kind of get the idea that if I wanted to, I could also put in the grade level and the student ID and so forth. Okay, but just for demonstration purposes, let's just put the last name and the first name. Okay, so I've made this string. I've called it return string. And I've included so far, it's a string that has a label for the last name, then a new line, then label for the first name, then the first name, then a new line. Okay, so it's this kind of string that kind of just gives us the name of the student. Now the last thing we have to do is we have to kick it back to the main calling program. So I have to tell the compiler that this is the string, this is the information that I want the main program to receive when it calls this function. Okay, it's like the answer to the function. So I use keyword return, and I put the string that I want it to kick back. So return string. So what this is going to do is it's going to take return string, it's going to kick it back to the main calling program and give it that as its answer. And then the main calling program can take that and use it however it wants. Okay, so here's my method, here's my function. My toString function, no parameters. It's going to kick back a string back to the main calling program, and it's public, so anybody can use it. It constructs this string that has the last name and first name, and then returns it back, is what it actually does in the code. Okay, so there's our method, there's our function. So let's go back to our main program and let's actually see how we can use that. Okay, so we have a couple of students and a teacher created. So let's say we want to take this first student, student 1, and we want to, now that we've created him, let's see if we can print out some information about him. Okay, so we know our class has a toString method. So let's make a print statement. And let's print out for student 1. Let's call the toString method to print out the information about that student. Okay, so look at how I did it. So this syntax, you may have seen that before. We used that when we had the equals function or equals method for strings. This kind of so-called dot syntax. You put the name of your instance, of your class, in this case student 1, dot, and then the function or the method that you're calling from that class. Okay, so for student 1, we're calling the toString method. So it's going to go to the class description, I'm going to look up the toString method. Oh, okay, so what I do is I make this string, I create it, and then I send it back to the calling program. The calling program is going to get that back as its answer, and then it's going to print it out. Okay, so let's try run it, and let's see what it does. Okay, so compiles, it's compiling, no errors, and there you go. So you can see, okay, printed out last name Smith, first name John. Okay, so that is an example of how we can now add in some action to our classes. So here's for student 2. This would be Emily Chang. So student 2, toString, let's see what that prints out. So it should print out first John Smith and then Emily Chang. So let's see. Okay, so it's compiling. There's John Smith, there's Emily Chang. Okay, so you can see for each of the different variables, student 1, student 2, each of the so-called instances of the class, student 1 and student 2, it printed out different data because that particular object or that particular instance had different information stored in it, and it prints it out. Okay, so there's an example of a very common method that's used. Almost every class that you write is going to have a toString method. It's customary for programmers and developers to put in a toString method because when your developer wants to get kind of just a snapshot of what your class is all about, what information it has, the instance of the class, then it can call the toString method to get that. Okay, now notice the toString method, it doesn't actually print it out. All it does is create a string and then send that string back. It's up to the main program to decide when it wants to print it out, or maybe it might want to combine that string with another string. So the toString method actually doesn't print it out, it just creates it and sends it back. And then the calling program, the main program, will decide when it wants to print it out. Okay, so there's an example of a very common method for functions, and you could, or for classes. You could also put one for the teacher class as well. Same idea. Put a toString method for the teacher class. Okay, so now you have a pretty good foundation, kind of a springboard for doing some pretty neat stuff with classes.